February 1942, the Pacific War raged across Southeast Asia. Japanese forces had swept through Malaya and Singapore, leaving a trail of chaos and fear. Among those caught in the storm of conquest were the brave women of the Australian Army Nursing Service. Young, determined, and bound by their oath to save lives even in the most harrowing circumstances. The nurses were stationed on Bangka Island, a strategic outpost in the Dutch East Indies. They were not combatants. Their weapons were stethoscopes, bandages, and a commitment to care. Yet, in the cruel calculus of war, neutrality offered no shield. Japanese troops, advancing with overwhelming speed, captured those who fled the chaos of Singapore's fall. Among the captured were 22 Australian Army nurses, young women who had witnessed the horrors of battle yet were now thrust into unimaginable terror. The story that would unfold on Radji Beach would remain suppressed for decades, a secret buried by the tides of history and silence imposed by wartime reporting and post-war politics. Only one would survive, and her survival would become the single thread connecting truth to memory: Vivian Bullwinkel, who would later testify about the atrocities committed. Her testimony revealed the massacre's chilling details and, decades later, would illuminate the previously obscured experiences of women in wartime, including the credible allegations of sexual assault that had been hidden from public awareness for 77 years. The nurses had fled Singapore by ship, hoping to escape the approaching Japanese advance. When the ship was sunk by enemy action, the survivors were forced to swim to shore, exhausted and terrified. Among them were young women who had devoted their lives to healing, yet the line between mercy and cruelty would be violently erased. They gathered on the beach, tending to the wounded, tending to each other, not knowing that the soldiers watching them were about to decide their fate. The massacre itself was swift and brutal. One by one, the nurses were executed. The men who survived were also systematically eliminated, their bodies concealed. Bullwinkel survived only because she pretended to be dead, lying among the lifeless bodies as the soldiers left. In her later recounting, she described a silence so absolute it seemed unnatural, punctuated by the cries and footsteps of those who had already perished. She bore witness, but the world would not immediately listen. Even after the war, the official records were incomplete. The testimony of survivors like Bullwinkel was minimized, and the allegations of sexual violence, supported by forensic evidence and survivor recollection, were omitted or downplayed. It was not until decades later that historians began to piece together the full scope of the crimes on Bangka Island, revealing the hidden layers of cruelty inflicted upon women who had volunteered to heal, not harm. The suppression of this history was not merely bureaucratic. It reflected a broader reluctance to confront the sexual violence inflicted upon women during wartime, a pattern repeated across the Pacific theater. For 77 years, the details of what happened to the nurses remained largely invisible, overshadowed by the larger narratives of battles, strategy, and national heroism. Yet beneath the surface, the truth persisted, carried in fragments of testimony, in the memories of survivors, and in the meticulous records kept by investigators who refused to let history forget. This is not a story of combat heroism in the conventional sense. It is a story of resilience, of witnessing, and of the human spirit enduring against overwhelming cruelty. It is a story of one bullet that missed, and how that narrow margin of fate preserved a voice that would eventually tell the world what happened. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The once formidable British stronghold had collapsed under the relentless advance of Japanese forces, and tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, nurses, and civilians found themselves suddenly in enemy hands. Among them were the nurses of the Australian Army Nursing Service, INS. Young women who had trained rigorously to serve on the front lines of medicine, not combat. Their courage was matched only by their vulnerability. In a war defined by the ruthless calculus of power, women in uniform often faced dangers that soldiers did not anticipate. These nurses were committed to saving lives, tending to the wounded, and maintaining a semblance of humanity amid chaos. When the Japanese forces began their sweep across Malaya and Singapore, the nurses were ordered to evacuate. Their journey was perilous from the start. They boarded ships overcrowded with refugees and wounded soldiers, seeking to escape the imminent fall of Singapore. Among them were 22 women who would later be captured on Bangka Island. Their escape, however, ended in disaster. One of the vessels was attacked and sunk, leaving survivors to fight for their lives in the waters surrounding the island. Exhausted, dehydrated, and traumatized, the survivors struggled to reach shore. Once on the beach, they tended to the wounded and attempted to care for each other. It was here that their ordeal would reach its darkest moment. The Japanese soldiers arrived soon after. Orders were carried out swiftly, leaving little room for negotiation or mercy. The men among the survivors were executed first, their bodies left as a grim warning. The 22 nurses were gathered together, separated from the others, and led to the edge of the beach. Among them was Vivian Bullwinkel, whose training and composure would ultimately save her life. The massacre was brutal and systematic. Each nurse was executed, their bodies left in the sand. Historical records and survivor testimony suggest that some were assaulted before being killed, an allegation supported by post-war research and forensic studies. These acts of sexual violence were largely suppressed in official reports, reflecting the reluctance of military and governmental authorities to acknowledge the full extent of atrocities committed against women during wartime. For decades, these details remained hidden, known only to the few survivors who had the courage to speak out. Vivian Bullwinkel's survival was a matter of both fate and presence of mind. She played dead among the corpses of her colleagues, remaining perfectly still despite the chaos surrounding her. 4 hours she endured the sweltering sun, the cries of the wounded, and the footsteps of soldiers moving through the sand. Her ability to survive was not merely luck. It was a testament to her training, discipline, and will to live. Bullwinkel later recounted every detail she could remember, providing a critical eyewitness account that would eventually challenge decades of silence. Her testimony was invaluable in reconstructing the events on Radji Beach. It revealed the full scope of the massacre, including the calculated nature of the executions and the additional crimes committed against women. Bullwinkel described how the nurses were herded together, the manner in which they were killed, and the desperate struggle to maintain composure in the face of imminent death. Importantly, she documented the presence of sexual violence, not in graphic detail, but with sufficient clarity to allow historians to understand that these crimes had occurred and had been deliberately suppressed in post-war reports. The suppression of these events was multifaceted. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied authorities prioritized the prosecution of military leaders for large-scale war crimes, often overlooking the gendered nature of violence against women. Survivors like Bullwinkel faced cultural and institutional barriers to sharing their experiences. The focus of public attention was on battlefield heroism, strategy, and national narratives of victory and defeat, leaving the specific experiences of women largely invisible. As years passed, researchers began to uncover additional evidence. Archival documents, personal diaries, and interviews with surviving witnesses painted a more complete picture of what had occurred on Bangka Island. The recognition of sexual violence as a distinct aspect of wartime atrocity was part of a broader shift in historical methodology, one that emphasized women's experiences and the hidden dimensions of conflict. The massacre had profound effects on the surviving nurses and their families. Bullwinkel, despite her trauma, returned to service and dedicated herself to documenting the events as accurately as possible. Her courage ensured that the world would eventually learn the truth, even if it took decades for the full scope to be acknowledged. Memorials, plaques, and public commemorations now honor the nurses of Bangka Island, highlighting not only their sacrifice but also the resilience and strength of women in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The historical significance of Bangka Island extends beyond the immediate events. It underscores the often overlooked dangers faced by women in wartime, particularly in regions where military authority operated with impunity. It also highlights the long-term consequences of suppressing testimony. For 77 years, the full story remained largely invisible, shaping public understanding of the war in incomplete ways. Only through the meticulous work of historians, the courage of survivors, and the commitment to uncover suppressed narratives has the full truth emerged. By examining the massacre in detail, it becomes clear that wartime atrocities against women were not anomalies but part of a systemic pattern of gendered violence that has historically been underreported. The Bangka Island massacre serves as a case study in how survival, testimony, and historical research can intersect to reveal truths that were once hidden, ensuring that future generations understand both the horrors of war and the resilience of those who endure it. Bullwinkel's later life was a testament to perseverance. She continued to serve in the medical field, contributed to war memorial efforts, and became an advocate for the recognition of women's contributions and sacrifices during World War II. Her story illustrates how one survivor can bridge the gap between atrocity and historical record, transforming personal trauma into a public testament that challenges silence and denial. The legacy of Bangka Island resonates in multiple dimensions: historically, ethically, and socially. It informs contemporary discussions about wartime sexual violence, the ethical responsibilities of military and political institutions, and the importance of survivor testimony. The massacre also serves as a stark reminder that the impacts of war extend far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the lives of those whose primary role is to heal, not to fight. In addition to memorialization, the events at Bangka Island have informed scholarship on gender and war. Historians and social scientists now routinely consider the experiences of women in conflict zones, understanding that narratives dominated by combatant actions can obscure the profound suffering endured by non-combatants. Through this lens, the massacre of the nurses becomes not just a story of execution, but a critical entry point into understanding systemic injustices faced by women during wartime. Finally, the continued study of Bangka Island reminds us that history is often mediated by power, by who writes it, who is listened to, and who is silenced. The uncovering of suppressed testimonies such as Bullwinkel's represents a corrective to historical erasure, ensuring that acts of courage and endurance are not lost to time. It emphasizes that even in the face of overwhelming violence, the human spirit can bear witness, preserving memory for generations to come. The sun set over Bangka Island long ago, casting shadows across Radji Beach where 22 young Australian nurses met their tragic fate. Yet even as decades passed, the memory of that day refused to fade. History, often selective, had chosen silence for 77 years. But some truths cannot be buried indefinitely. The story of Vivian Bullwinkel, the lone survivor, became a beacon, a testament to resilience, courage, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be extinguished even in the darkest hours. Bullwinkel's survival was more than luck. It was discipline, training, and an unbreakable will to live. Lying among the bodies of her colleagues, she bore witness to what had happened: the calculated executions, the cold precision of the soldiers, and the atrocities that had been inflicted upon women whose only crime was to save lives. Her testimony would eventually pierce the decades of silence, revealing not only the massacre but also the suppressed allegations of sexual assault, which historians later recognized as an essential part of the Bangka Island narrative. The journey from survivor to witness was neither simple nor immediate. In the years following the war, Bullwinkel returned to Australia, attempting to rebuild her life while carrying the weight of trauma and memory. She had to navigate a society that often minimized the experiences of women during war, particularly when those experiences involved sexual violence. Yet she persisted, testifying before military and historical inquiries, ensuring that her colleagues' lives were remembered and their suffering acknowledged. Through her voice, the world learned what had been intentionally hidden: that war's cruelty often extends beyond the battlefield and that women, even those in uniform, can become targets of deliberate, gendered violence. Historians, too, played a critical role in restoring truth to this story. For decades, archival research, interviews, and forensic investigations pieced together the fragmented evidence left behind. Documents once dismissed as incomplete or unremarkable gained significance when cross-referenced with survivor accounts. Researchers examined inconsistencies in post-war reports, revealing patterns of suppression, evidence that the massacre and associated atrocities had been deliberately minimized in official records. Through this painstaking work, the full scale of the tragedy came into focus, offering long overdue recognition for the courage of those who perished and those who survived. Bangka Island's legacy is multi-layered. On one level, it is a story of unimaginable horror, a massacre carried out with cold precision, lives cut short, and innocence violated. On another, it is a story of extraordinary resilience and endurance. The nurses in their final hours embodied selflessness, compassion, and professionalism. They were healers to the last breath, and their actions, remembered through survivor testimony, memorials, and historical scholarship, continue to inspire. Memorials on Bangka Island and in Australia now honor these women. Plaques, ceremonies, and educational programs ensure that future generations understand the human cost of war and the unique vulnerabilities faced by women in conflict zones. These commemorations are more than symbolic. They are corrective acts, countering decades of silence and historical erasure. They affirm that the experiences of women are not marginal footnotes but central components of wartime history. The Bangka Island massacre also holds profound lessons for contemporary society. It underscores the importance of bearing witness and recording testimony before it is lost to time. Bullwinkel's courage demonstrates that even in situations of extreme danger and trauma, individuals can serve as custodians of history, preserving truth for generations that may never see war firsthand. Her story highlights the critical role of survivors in shaping historical understanding and challenging the selective narratives imposed by official powers. Moreover, the massacre reminds us of the broader ethical and moral responsibilities of societies confronting wartime atrocities. Recognizing the suffering of women in conflicts, acknowledging sexual violence as a deliberate instrument of war, and ensuring accountability are essential steps toward justice. The suppression of testimony, whether intentional or systemic, not only dishonors victims but also perpetuates cycles of ignorance and injustice. In this light, Bangka Island serves as a cautionary tale. History remembered incompletely is history that risks repeating itself. In the years since the massacre, the narrative has evolved. Scholars, journalists, and filmmakers have documented the events with rigor and sensitivity. Each retelling incorporates the voices of survivors, the context of wartime chaos, and the broader framework of Japanese war crimes across the Pacific. The story has transcended its immediate tragedy to become emblematic of women's experiences in wartime, challenging traditional narratives that focus solely on soldiers, battles, and territorial conquests. The enduring significance of the massacre is also personal. Families of the nurses, once left with little explanation, finally received recognition of their loved ones' bravery and suffering. Bullwinkel's advocacy extended beyond her colleagues to all women affected by conflict, emphasizing that their stories are indispensable to understanding the human dimensions of war. By connecting personal trauma to collective memory, she ensured that the lessons of Bangka Island reach far beyond the shores of Indonesia or the pages of history books. Even as the decades passed, the phrase, "one bullet missed," encapsulates more than a moment of chance. It symbolizes survival against overwhelming odds, the importance of testimony in the face of deliberate erasure, and the fragile yet enduring power of human resilience. It is a reminder that one individual's courage can preserve truth, illuminate injustice, and ensure that even the most harrowing episodes of history are not forgotten. The Bangka Island story also illuminates the intersection of war, gender, and memory. Women's experiences in conflict, historically marginalized, are now recognized as central to understanding both the conduct of war and its long-term consequences. Sexual violence, often unreported and ignored, is now acknowledged in historical scholarship as a deliberate and devastating aspect of conflict. By addressing these realities, the narrative of Bangka Island contributes to broader conversations about gendered violence, historical justice, and societal responsibility. Finally, the massacre underscores a universal truth. Even in the depths of human cruelty, acts of courage and integrity endure. The nurses of Bangka Island, whether in their final moments or through the perseverance of Bullwinkel's testimony, embody the resilience of the human spirit. Their story reminds us that history is not only about the actions of the powerful but also about the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. Through memorials, research, and public education, the legacy of Bangka Island continues to shape our understanding of war. It teaches future generations about the importance of vigilance against injustice, the necessity of listening to survivors, and the profound cost of silence. By bearing witness to the lives lost and the suffering endured, society ensures that such atrocities are never repeated, and that the sacrifices of those who gave everything in the service of others are never forgotten. In closing, the Bangka Island massacre is not merely a story of war. It is a story of resilience, of courage, and of truth surviving against the currents of suppression. It is a testament to the indomitable human spirit, the power of witness, and the enduring importance of remembering those who were silenced. It is a reminder that even one bullet that misses can alter the course of history, preserving memory, justice, and the lessons that must never be lost.